The morning Layla Mansour disappeared, the jasmine outside her bedroom window was in full bloom. Her mother, Fatima, would later remember this detail with startling clarity, how the white flowers seemed almost luminous against the Jerusalem stone of their East Jerusalem home, how their fragrance drifted through the half-open window as she called up the stairs for the third time. "Layla, Habibti, you'll be late for school." If this story of a brilliant mind lost too soon reminds you of the young dreamers in your own life, consider sharing it with someone who needs to remember that every voice matters, no matter how quietly it speaks. But 16-year-old Layla was already gone. Her backpack sat by the front door, stuffed with textbooks and a worn notebook filled with equations that would have impressed university professors. Her science fair project, a meticulously crafted model demonstrating sustainable water purification using solar energy and locally sourced materials, waited in the garage, covered by an old bedsheet. She'd spent months on it, working late into the night by the light of her desk lamp, her hijab pushed back as she soldered circuits and calculated efficiency ratios with the precision of someone far older than her years. The autumn air in Jerusalem carried its usual mixture of dust and possibility, but that morning it felt different somehow. Neighbors would later describe an unsettling quiet, as if the ancient city itself was holding its breath. Fatima climbed the narrow stairs, her slippers soft against the ceramic tiles. The house, built in the traditional style with thick walls and arched doorways, seemed to absorb sound differently that morning. When she pushed open Layla's door, the bed was made with military precision, sheets pulled tight, pillows perfectly positioned. The desk was cleared except for a single pen lying across an open physics textbook, marking a chapter on electromagnetic radiation. The Layla was nowhere to be found. The window stood open exactly as she'd left it the night before, the white curtains moving gently in the morning breeze. Fatima touched the fabric, noting how it felt slightly damp with dew, and called out into the courtyard below. Only the neighbor's cat answered, stretching lazily in a patch of sunlight. Ahmed Mansour was already at his job at the telecommunications company when Fatima called. Her voice, usually steady and warm, carried an edge of worry that made his stomach drop. "She's not here, Ahmed. Her bed is made, but she's not here." By noon, when Layla failed to appear at the Beit Hanina Secondary School, panic began to settle over the family like dust after a windstorm. Her best friend, Noor, waited by the school gates long after the final bell, scanning every face that passed. The science fair was only 3 days away, and Layla had been excited in that quiet, determined way of hers. Not the bubbly enthusiasm of her classmates, but something deeper, more purposeful. She talked about changing things, Noor would tell the police later, about making water clean for everyone, not just people in rich neighborhoods. She said science didn't care about politics or religion, it just cared about being true. The investigation began the way most missing person cases do, in a city where tension runs as deep as ancient roots. Questions were asked, neighbors were interviewed. The family's modest home was searched, though Fatima couldn't understand what the officers expected to find. Layla's room remained exactly as she'd left it. Textbooks stacked by subject, her prayer rug folded neatly in the corner, and on her desk, a small photo of Marie Curie, torn from a magazine and pinned to a corkboard filled with scientific formulas written in her careful handwriting. The local news picked up the story briefly. A bright Muslim student vanished without a trace. But in a city where headlines competed daily with centuries of conflict, Layla's disappearance soon faded from public attention. The search continued for weeks, then months, then quietly dissolved into the category of cold cases that haunt small communities and burden families with questions that have no answers. Her science fair project remained in the garage, covered and forgotten, gathering dust, like so many dreams deferred. 10 years have a way of changing everything and nothing at the same time. The jasmine outside Layla's bedroom window continued to bloom each spring, its fragrance drifting through a room that Fatima couldn't bring herself to change. The physics textbook still lay open to the same page, the pen marking the chapter on electromagnetic radiation like a bookmark in time. Ahmed had grown grayer around the temples, his once confident stride now carrying the weight of a question that followed him everywhere. Could I have done something different? He'd taken early retirement from the telecommunications company, spending his days tending a small olive grove on the outskirts of the city that had belonged to his grandfather. The repetitive work of pruning and harvesting provided a rhythm that helped quiet the endless speculation in his mind. Fatima continued teaching Arabic literature at the local elementary school, pouring her motherly energy into other people's children. Her colleagues knew better than to ask about Lila directly, but they noticed how she lingered after parent conferences, how she watched her students with an intensity that went beyond professional concern. She kept every Mother's Day card, every crayon drawing, every small token of affection, as if collecting evidence that love, once given, never truly disappears. The neighborhood around their East Jerusalem home had evolved in subtle ways. New families moved in, bringing different accents and traditions. The corner market where Lila used to buy notebooks and mechanical pencils changed hands twice. The old man who sold fresh bread from a cart near the school gates was replaced by his nephew, who didn't remember the bright-eyed girl who always said "Shukran" with genuine warmth. But some things remained constant. The call to prayer still echoed 5 times daily from the nearby mosque, its familiar cadence marking time in a way that felt both comforting and cruel. The muezzin's voice, rich and resonant in the pre-dawn darkness, gentle in the evening glow, served as a reminder that life continued its sacred rhythm even when individual lives were interrupted. Noor had married young, moving to Ramallah with her husband and starting a family. She named her eldest daughter Lila, though she never explained the choice to her in-laws. Sometimes, driving through Jerusalem to visit her parents, she would slow her car as she passed the Mansour house, noting how the garden had grown wild in places, how Ahmed had built a small greenhouse where he grew tomatoes and herbs with the same meticulous attention his daughter had once applied to her experiments. The science fair at Beit Hanina Secondary School continued annually, though it had grown larger and more competitive over the years. Students from across East Jerusalem now participated, their projects displayed in the renovated gymnasium under bright fluorescent lights. There was a trophy case near the entrance, filled with awards and photographs of winners, but a careful observer might notice that 2012 was represented only by a small gap, a missing piece in the school's collective memory. Dr. Khalil Rashad, who had taught chemistry at the school for 15 years, still remembered Lila's project proposal. She had approached him after class one day in October 2011, her notebook filled with sketches and calculations. "I want to make clean water accessible in refugee camps," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper but her eyes burning with conviction. Not just temporary solutions, but something sustainable that people can maintain themselves. He had encouraged her, helped her order materials, even stayed after school on several occasions to assist with the more complex engineering aspects of her design. Her approach was unconventional, combining traditional Middle Eastern water management techniques with modern solar technology in a way that was both innovative and culturally sensitive. She understood instinctively what many engineers took years to learn, that the best solutions are often the ones that work with existing systems rather than against them. The night before her disappearance, she had called him at home, something students never did. "Dr. Rashad," she had said, and he could hear the excitement barely contained in her voice. "I think I solved the filtration efficiency problem." The key was thinking about it like a traditional well system, but in reverse. He had planned to see her demonstration the next morning, but she never came to school. Her project remained in the chemistry storage room for months after she disappeared, taking up space that was eventually needed for new equipment. Dr. Rashad had carefully documented everything, her calculations, her methodology, her innovative use of locally available materials, and stored it all in a filing cabinet in his office. Sometimes, grading papers late in the evening, he would catch sight of her file and wonder what discoveries the world had lost. The school's administration changed over the years. The old principal, Mr. Khoury, had retired in 2018, his place taken by a younger woman named Sarah Habash, who brought fresh energy and modern ideas to the institution. She had studied education in Jordan and later at Oxford, returning to Jerusalem with a determination to give her students every opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background or circumstances. Sarah Habash believed in the power of clean spaces and clear thinking. When she accepted the position of principal at Beit Hanina Secondary School in the autumn of 2022, her first project was organizing the storage areas that had accumulated a decade's worth of educational detritus. The chemistry storage room, in particular, had become a repository for outdated textbooks, broken equipment, and forgotten projects from science fairs past. The November afternoon when she discovered Layla's project was unremarkably typical, gray clouds gathering over the Jerusalem hills, the kind of weather that made everyone want to finish their work quickly and head home to warm tea and familiar routines. Sarah had been in the storage room for 2 hours, sorting through boxes of materials and making lists of what could be salvaged, donated, or discarded. She was reaching for a box of old microscopes when her hand brushed against something covered by a paint-splattered tarp. Pulling back the covering, she found herself looking at what was clearly a student project, a carefully constructed water purification system that, even under a layer of dust, showed remarkable sophistication. The model was built on a rectangular base about the size of a large desk, with multiple components connected by clear tubing and small electronic devices. Solar panels were arranged at optimal angles, feeding power to a series of pumps and filters. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was the documentation, a 3-ring binder filled with handwritten calculations, diagrams, and research notes that demonstrated a level of scientific rigor she rarely saw even from her best students. The name on the front page was written in careful Arabic script, Layla Mansour, class of 2012. Sarah flipped through the pages, her education background allowing her to appreciate the complexity of what she was seeing. This wasn't a simple science fair project. This was genuine research that addressed a real-world problem with innovative solutions. Layla had identified specific challenges in providing clean water to temporary settlements and refugee camps, then developed a system that was both technologically advanced and culturally appropriate. The methodology was meticulous. Layla had researched traditional water management systems throughout the Middle East, studying everything from ancient Roman aqueducts to modern Israeli desalination plants. She had interviewed refugees about their specific needs and constraints, understanding that any solution had to be maintainable by people without technical training and adaptable to different geographic conditions. Her innovation lay in combining solar-powered filtration with a gravity-fed distribution system that mimicked the function of traditional wells. The purification process used multiple stages: sand filtration inspired by ancient techniques, UV sterilization powered by solar collectors, and a final stage that added essential minerals back into the water. The entire system was designed to be built using materials available in most developing regions, with detailed instructions for maintenance and repair. But perhaps most impressive was her understanding of the social and economic factors that would determine the project's success. She had calculated costs, identified potential funding sources, and even developed a training program for local technicians. This was thinking far beyond what was typically expected from a high school science project. Sarah found herself sitting cross-legged on the storage room floor, completely absorbed in reading through Layla's work. The girl had included a section on implementation strategy that showed remarkable maturity and cultural sensitivity. She understood that introducing new technology into traditional communities required more than just engineering expertise. It required trust, respect, and a deep understanding of existing social structures. At the bottom of one page, Layla had written a note to herself in the margin. Remember, technology serves people, not the other way around. The best solutions are the ones people can make their own. Sarah looked up from the notebook and studied the physical model again. Even after 10 years in storage, the construction quality was evident. The solar panels were properly angled and connected, the filtration system was logically organized, and the distribution network showed careful attention to hydraulic principles. This was work that could have competed at the university level, yet it had been created by a 16-year-old high school student. She turned to the final section of the notebook, labeled Future Development. Here, Layla had outlined potential improvements to the system, including ideas for scaling up production, adapting the design for different climates, and integrating the technology with existing infrastructure. Some of her suggestions were remarkably prescient. She had anticipated developments in solar technology and water treatment that had only become commercially viable in recent years. On the last page, dated just 3 days before the 2012 science fair, Layla had written, "I believe this project could change lives. Water is a human right, not a privilege. If we can make clean water accessible everywhere, we remove one of the biggest barriers to human dignity and opportunity." Sarah closed the notebook and sat in silence for several minutes, processing what she had discovered. This wasn't just an impressive student project. This was potentially groundbreaking work that had been sitting forgotten in a storage room for a decade. She had questions. Why hadn't this project been submitted to the science fair? What had happened to the student who created it? And most importantly, what had the world lost when this brilliant mind disappeared from view? She carefully gathered all the components of Layla's project, making sure nothing was left behind. The model, the documentation, and several boxes of related materials were moved to her office, where she could study them more thoroughly. But first, she needed to find out what had happened to Layla Mansour. Sarah's investigation began the way most searches for forgotten stories do, with a simple internet query that yielded surprisingly little information. Layla Mansour, missing 2012 Jerusalem, brought up a few old news articles, brief and clinical in their reporting. Local student disappears. Read one headline from a community newspaper. The articles provided basic facts but no real insight into who Lila had been or what had happened to her. The school's records were more helpful, though incomplete. Lila's academic file showed exceptional grades in mathematics and sciences, with particular strength in physics and chemistry. Her teachers had noted her quiet intelligence and creative problem-solving abilities. Dr. Khalil Rashad, still teaching at the school, remembered her vividly when Sarah approached him. "Brilliant girl," he said, adjusting his glasses as he settled into his office chair. Outside the window, students were heading home in the late afternoon light, their conversations mixing Arabic and English in the easy way of young people comfortable with multiple worlds. Absolutely brilliant. But more than that, she had vision. She understood that science wasn't just about understanding how things work, but about making things work better for people who needed help. Dr. Rashad pulled out his own files, showing Sarah the documentation he had kept of Layla's project development. "She came to me with this idea about water purification, and I thought it would be a typical student project. You know, something simple, maybe effective, but basic. Then she started showing me her research." He spread out photocopies of Lila's early sketches and calculations. "Look at this approach. She didn't just study existing technology, she studied the communities that would use it. She understood that the best engineering solution isn't worth anything if people can't afford it, maintain it, or trust it." Sarah examined the materials, noting the progression from initial concepts to sophisticated design. "What happened to her project? Why wasn't it submitted to the science fair?" Dr. Rashad's expression grew somber. "She disappeared 3 days before the fair. Just gone. No explanation. No goodbye. The police investigated, but they never found anything. Her family was devastated. Do you think—" Sarah paused, unsure how to phrase her question diplomatically. "Do you think her background had anything to do with her project being overlooked, even after she disappeared?" The chemistry teacher was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "You have to understand the climate in 2012. There was a lot of tension, a lot of suspicion. A Muslim student working on water purification technology, talking about refugee camps and infrastructure. Some people might have seen that as political rather than scientific." He pulled out a folder filled with newspaper clippings from the period. Headlines about security concerns, political protests, and cultural conflicts painted a picture of a community under stress. In that environment, Sarah could imagine how an innovative project by a Muslim teenager might have been viewed with unwarranted suspicion rather than the scientific appreciation it deserved. "I tried to keep her work safe," Dr. Rashad continued. "I thought maybe she'd come back, or maybe her family would want it. But after a while, it just became part of the storage room collection. I'm ashamed to say I stopped thinking about it." Sarah spent the following week reaching out to former teachers and administrators who might have known Lila. The picture that emerged was of a student who stood out not for seeking attention, but for the quiet intensity of her intellectual curiosity. She had been particularly close to her physics teacher, Mrs. Amira Qasemi, who had encouraged her to think beyond textbook problems and consider real-world applications. Lila understood something that many students miss, Mrs. Qasemi explained during a phone conversation. She had moved to Amman years earlier but remembered Lila clearly. She understood that physics isn't just about equations. It's about making the world work better. Her questions were always practical. How could we make this more efficient? How could we make this accessible to people without resources? The former physics teacher also confirmed Dr. Rashad's observation about the climate of 2012. There was so much focus on security and politics that year. Students like Lila, brilliant, thoughtful students who wanted to solve real problems, sometimes got lost in all the noise. It's a tragedy, really. We should have been celebrating minds like hers, not letting them slip through the cracks. Sarah's most revealing conversation came from an unexpected source, the janitor who had worked at the school for over 20 years. Abu Mohammed remembered Lila because she was one of the few students who always thanked him for his work, and sometimes stayed after school to help clean up the chemistry lab after her experiments. She was different from the other students, he said, pausing in his mopping to look out at the courtyard where students were playing soccer. Not because she was smarter, though she was very smart, but because she noticed people. She saw everyone, you understand? Rich students, poor students, teachers, staff, we were all just people to her. He leaned on his mop handle, remembering. The week before she disappeared, she was very excited about something. She kept talking about how her project could help people in the camps, how it could make a real difference. She asked me about my family in Gaza, about the water situation there. Most students don't think about such things. Abu Muhammad's memory provided another crucial detail. The day she disappeared, that morning, I saw her father drop her off at the front gate like usual. She had her backpack and a small box, like she was bringing something for a teacher. She waved to me and said, "See you tomorrow, Abu Muhammad." But tomorrow never came. That evening, Sarah sat in her office surrounded by Lila's documentation, trying to piece together not just what had happened to the girl, but why her remarkable work had been forgotten so completely. The project wasn't just impressive for a high school student. It was genuinely innovative work that could have made a real difference in addressing water scarcity issues that affected millions of people. She found herself wondering how many other brilliant minds had disappeared into the cracks of a system more concerned with managing conflicts than nurturing potential. How many projects like Lila's were gathering dust in storage rooms, their innovations lost to the world because their creators didn't fit into narrow definitions of who was supposed to be a scientist or innovator. As the sun set over Jerusalem, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber, Sarah made a decision. She was going to find Lila's family and return her project to them. More than that, she was going to make sure the world knew about the brilliant work that had been overlooked for a decade. But first, she needed to understand what had really happened to Lila Mansour. The address in Lila's school file led Sarah through the winding streets of East Jerusalem to a neighborhood where traditional stone buildings stood alongside modern apartment blocks, creating a cityscape that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. The late November air carried the scent of olive oil and za'atar from nearby bakeries, mixing with the exhaust from buses navigating the narrow roads. Sarah found the Mansour house tucked into a residential street lined with olive trees, their silver-green leaves rustling in the Mediterranean breeze. The building was typical of the area, Jerusalem stone construction with arched windows and a small courtyard garden. The jasmine that had bloomed outside Lila's window 10 years earlier had grown into a substantial vine, its branches now covering much of the front wall in a cascade of green leaves. When Fatima Mansour opened the door, Sarah was struck immediately by the woman's composed dignity. Though clearly in her 50s now, with silver threading through her dark hair, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had learned to find strength in sorrow. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, studied Sarah with the careful attention of someone who had answered too many questions from too many strangers over the years. "Mrs. Mansour," Sarah said in Arabic, "my name is Sarah Habash. I'm the principal at Beit Hanina Secondary School. I wondered if we might speak about your daughter, Layla." The mention of her daughter's name caused a subtle shift in Fatima's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of resigned recognition, as if she had been expecting this conversation for years without knowing when it would come. "Please, come in," Fatima said, stepping aside to welcome Sarah into the cool interior of the house. The living room was furnished in the traditional style, with low, cushioned seating arranged around a central coffee table. Family photographs lined the walls, wedding pictures, children's school photos, and prominently displayed several images of Layla at different ages. In one, she was perhaps 12 years old, wearing a school uniform and holding a small trophy. In another, she appeared to be working on some kind of science experiment, her hijab pushed back slightly as she focused intently on adjusting what looked like a solar panel. "You've come about her project," Fatima said as she prepared tea, not asking but stating it as a fact. Sarah was surprised by the directness. "Yes, actually. How did you know?" Fatima smiled sadly as she arranged small glasses on a tray. "Because every year around this time, I wonder if someone will finally understand what she was trying to do, what she accomplished." Ahmed emerged from another room, having heard voices. 10 years had indeed added gray to his temples, and his handshake had the careful firmness of someone who had learned to be cautious with strangers. But his eyes, like his wife's, held a depth of intelligence that spoke of long consideration of difficult questions. "You found her work," he said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. "It wasn't a question." "In our storage room," Sarah confirmed. "I can't believe it was forgotten for so long. The level of innovation, the thoroughness of her research. This is genuinely groundbreaking work." Fatima and Ahmed exchanged a look that contained years of shared understanding. "We tried to tell people," Fatima said quietly. "After she disappeared, we showed her project to journalists, to engineers, to anyone who would listen. They all said it was impressive for a high school student, but no one understood what she had really accomplished." Ahmed leaned forward. "The problem wasn't that people didn't think it was good work. The problem was that they couldn't believe it was her work. A 16-year-old Muslim girl from East Jerusalem couldn't possibly have developed something so sophisticated." The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a physical presence in the room. You mean they thought she had help? Or that she copied it from somewhere? One reporter actually asked us if her male teacher had done the real work, Fatima said, her voice carrying a trace of old anger. As if she couldn't have been capable of thinking for herself. Ahmed pulled out a worn folder from a cabinet near his chair. We documented everything. Her process, her research, her innovations. We have video of her explaining how the system works, photos of her building each component. But after she disappeared, he trailed off, but Sarah understood. After Layla vanished, her project became evidence in a missing person case, not a scientific innovation deserving of recognition. Tell me about her, Sarah said. What was she like? Fatima's face softened. Curious about everything. Even as a small child, she wanted to understand how things worked. But more than that, she wanted to understand how they could work better. She would see a problem and immediately start thinking about solutions. The water project came from a school trip, Ahmed added. They visited a refugee camp as part of a social studies class. Most students wrote reports about the political situation or the living conditions. Layla came home talking about the water system, how inefficient it was, how much energy was wasted, how the families had to spend so much time and effort just to get clean water for basic needs. Fatima nodded. She said, There has to be a better way, Mama. People shouldn't have to choose between clean water and everything else they need. She spent months researching, Ahmed continued. She read everything she could find about water purification, about solar energy, about refugee camp infrastructure. She interviewed engineers, visited water treatment facilities, even corresponded with researchers at universities. Sarah was taking notes, but more importantly, she was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been lost. This wasn't just a promising student who had disappeared. This was a young innovator whose work could have made a real difference in addressing one of the world's most pressing humanitarian challenges. What do you think happened to her? Sarah asked gently. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Fatima and Ahmed looked at each other again, communicating in the wordless way of couples who had weathered profound loss together. We don't know, Ahmed said finally. The police investigated thoroughly. There was no sign of violence, no indication of family problems, no history of running away. She just wasn't there one morning. She had been excited about the science fair, Fatima added. She was looking forward to presenting her project, to showing people what was possible. She had even prepared a presentation about how the system could be scaled up for larger communities. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She was planning to present it at the science fair? Yes, Ahmed confirmed. She had worked out all the details, practiced her presentation, even prepared materials for people to take home with information about implementing the system. But the science fair records show no entry from her for 2012, Sarah said. Ahmed's expression grew dark. Because she never had the chance to submit it officially, she disappeared 3 days before the registration deadline. The implications of this timeline were staggering. Not only had Layla's work been overlooked because of her disappearance, but it had never even been given the chance to compete with her peers' projects. The scientific community had lost not only a brilliant innovator, but also the opportunity to recognize and build upon her innovations. As the afternoon light faded outside the windows, Sarah realized she was sitting with two people who had spent a decade carrying the weight of not just personal loss, but also the knowledge that their daughter's potential contributions to the world had been forgotten along with her. I want to change that, Sarah said. I want people to know about her work, about what she accomplished. Would you be willing to help me? For the first time since Sarah had arrived, she saw something like hope flicker in Fatima's eyes. Sarah's campaign to bring recognition to Layla's work began quietly, the way most meaningful changes do, with careful research and methodical documentation. She spent December working with Dr. Rashad to photograph and catalog every aspect of Layla's project, creating a comprehensive digital record that could be shared with researchers and educators worldwide. The water purification system, even after 10 years in storage, demonstrated engineering principles that were remarkably advanced for its time. Sarah arranged for a water quality engineer from Hebrew University to examine the design independently. Dr. Miriam Levy, who specialized in sustainable water systems for developing regions, spent an entire afternoon studying Layla's work. This is extraordinary, Dr. Levy said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed Layla's calculations. She anticipated several developments in solar-powered water treatment that didn't become commercially viable until 2018 or 2019. Her understanding of the social and economic factors affecting implementation is more sophisticated than what I see from graduate students. Dr. Levy was particularly impressed by Lila's integration of traditional and modern techniques. She understood something that many engineers miss, that the best technology is often the technology that works with existing cultural patterns rather than against them. This design respects traditional water management practices while dramatically improving efficiency and safety. Sarah also reached out to water engineers working with refugee communities, sharing Layla's documentation with organizations like Engineers Without Borders and Water for Life International. The responses were uniformly positive and, in several cases, shocked. "We've been working on this exact problem set for years," wrote Dr. James Chen from the International Water Institute. "Some of the solutions this student proposed in 2012 are approaches we've only recently begun to implement. If this work had been published and developed further, it could have accelerated our field by several years." But perhaps the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. Sarah had sent Lila's documentation to a colleague at the American University of Beirut, who forwarded it to Professor Amina Hassan, a renowned expert in sustainable engineering for refugee populations. Professor Hassan's response arrived on a cold January morning that would forever change how Layla's work was understood. "I need to speak with you immediately," Professor Hassan had written. "The innovations described in this project directly address challenges we've been working on for over a decade. More than that, several of the specific technical solutions this student proposed have been independently developed by our team and are currently being implemented in refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon." The phone conversation that followed was illuminating and heartbreaking in equal measure. Professor Hassan explained that her research team had spent years developing water purification systems for temporary settlements, facing many of the same technical and social challenges that Lila had identified in her project. "What's remarkable," Professor Hassan said, "is not just that she identified these problems, but that her proposed solutions are so practical and culturally sensitive. We've learned through years of trial and error what she seemed to understand intuitively, that sustainable technology must be maintainable by the communities that use it." Professor Hassan was particularly interested in Layla's approach to training local technicians. This shows a level of systems thinking that's rare, even among experienced development professionals. She understood that technology transfer isn't just about hardware, it's about knowledge transfer and community empowerment. The conversation took on a more personal tone when Professor Hassan learned about Layla's disappearance. "This is a tragedy for our entire field," she said quietly. "Imagine what she might have accomplished with proper support and resources. Imagine the lives that might have been improved if her work had been recognized and developed further." Sarah began reaching out to science education organizations, sharing Lila's story as an example of overlooked talent and the importance of recognizing innovation regardless of its source. The response from educators was immediate and passionate. Many had similar stories of brilliant students whose work had been undervalued due to bias or circumstance. "This happens more often than we like to admit," said Dr. Rachel Martinez from the National Science Teachers Association. "Students from marginalized communities often face additional barriers to having their work taken seriously, especially when they're addressing problems that challenge established systems." Dr. Martinez helped Sarah prepare a presentation about Lila's work for the International Science Education Conference, scheduled for March in Istanbul. The presentation would focus not just on the technical innovations, but on the importance of creating educational environments where all students feel empowered to tackle complex problems. Meanwhile, Ahmed and Fatima had become actively involved in documenting their daughter's story. They provided photographs, videos, and personal anecdotes that helped flesh out the portrait of Lila as both a brilliant scientist and a compassionate human being committed to helping others. "She used to say that engineering was just organized compassion," Fatima told Sarah during one of their many conversations that winter. "She believed that if you really cared about people, you would find ways to solve their problems." Ahmed contributed technical details about Layla's work process, having closely observed her methods during the months she developed her project. "She was methodical, but also intuitive," he explained. "She would research everything thoroughly, but she also had an instinct for what would work in real-world conditions." As word of Lila's story spread through academic and professional networks, Sarah began receiving inquiries from researchers who wanted to build on her innovations. A team at MIT expressed interest in developing her solar-powered filtration system for use in disaster relief situations. Engineers in Kenya wanted to adapt her gravity-fed distribution design for rural communities without reliable electricity. It's bittersweet, Sarah reflected during a February evening conversation with Dr. Rashad. They were sitting in his office, reviewing the growing file of correspondence about Layla's project. We're finally giving her the recognition she deserved, but she's not here to see it, or to continue the work herself. Dr. Rashad nodded solemnly. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that her ideas live on and help people, even if she can't be here to see it happen. Maybe that's how we honor her memory, by making sure her vision becomes reality. Outside the chemistry lab windows, Jerusalem's ancient stones glowed in the setting sun, the same light that had illuminated Layla's workspace as she labored over equations and prototypes 10 years earlier. The city's complex history seemed to echo in the evening air, stories of brilliant minds, missed opportunities, and the eternal human struggle to build something better from the materials at hand. Sarah gathered up the correspondence and photographs, preparing to head home to continue planning the Istanbul presentation. As she turned off the lights in the lab, she could almost feel the presence of the young woman whose innovations were finally receiving the attention they had always deserved. Tomorrow she would call Professor Hassan to discuss the next steps in implementing Layla's water purification design in actual refugee camps. It wouldn't bring Layla back, but it would ensure that her vision of accessible clean water for everyone would finally have the chance to change lives. The Layla Mansour Memorial Science Fair was inaugurated on a bright April morning in 2023, exactly 11 years after her disappearance. Sarah had worked with the school administration, the Mansour family, and several international organizations to create an annual event that would celebrate innovative thinking while specifically encouraging students from underrepresented communities to participate. The gymnasium at Beit Hanina Secondary School had been transformed for the occasion. Layla's original water purification system occupied a place of honor near the entrance, fully restored and functional. A plaque beside it read, "In memory of Layla Mansour, 1996 to 2012, whose vision of engineering as organized compassion continues to inspire solutions for a better world." Students from across Jerusalem and the West Bank had submitted projects addressing real-world problems in their communities. The judging panel included not only local educators, but also international experts like Professor Hassan, who had traveled from Beirut specifically for the event. Dr. Levy from Hebrew University served as the lead judge, bringing her expertise in sustainable water systems to evaluate projects that built on themes similar to Layla's work. Ahmed and Fatima sat in the front row during the opening ceremony, watching as Sarah addressed the assembled students, teachers, and families. The weight of the moment was evident in their faces. Pride in their daughter's posthumous recognition mixed with the persistent ache of her absence. Layla Mansour understood that science is not just about discovering how the world works, Sarah told the audience, but about making the world work better for everyone. Today we celebrate not just her innovations, but her approach to problem solving that combined technical excellence with deep compassion for human needs. The ceremony included a presentation about Layla's water purification system and its ongoing development. Professor Hassan announced that the first pilot installations based on Layla's design would be implemented in 3 refugee camps in Jordan within the next 6 months, funded by a consortium of international development organizations. These installations will provide clean water for over 10,000 people, Professor Hassan explained, her voice carrying across the hushed gymnasium. Each one will bear a plaque crediting Layla Mansour as the original innovator. Her ideas will literally be saving lives. But the day held more than celebration and recognition. During the lunch break, while families and students gathered in the school courtyard, a middle-aged woman approached the Mansour family with obvious hesitation. She was slight and nervous, wearing a simple dress and carrying a worn handbag that she clutched tightly as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said in accented Arabic. "Are you Layla's parents?" Fatima looked up from her conversation with other attendees, noting the woman's anxious demeanor. "Yes, we are. I'm Fatima, and this is Ahmed. Did you know our daughter?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Maryam Khalil. I need to tell you something about Layla. Something I should have said years ago." Ahmed stood up immediately, his attention fully focused on this unexpected visitor. "Please, sit with us. What do you need to tell us?" Maryam glanced around nervously, as if worried about being overheard. I worked as a cleaning lady at a private research facility in West Jerusalem in 2012, the Technion Innovation Center. I was there the morning of November 15th, 2012. The date hit Ahmed and Fatima like a physical blow. November 15th was the day Lila had disappeared. I saw her, Mariam continued, her voice barely above a whisper. A young girl matching her description, wearing a hijab, carrying a large backpack and a box. She was arguing with security guards at the entrance. I remember because it was unusual. We didn't usually see Palestinians trying to enter the facility. Fatima grabbed Ahmed's hand, her knuckles white. What was she doing there? What did she want? I couldn't hear everything, Mariam said, but I heard her say something about a water purification project. She kept insisting that she had an appointment with someone, that she needed to show her research to a professor. The guards wouldn't let her in. Ahmed leaned forward. What happened then? She left, but she seemed upset. Very upset. I watched her walk toward the bus station, but then... Mariam paused, struggling with her words. I had to go inside to work. I never saw her again. Why didn't you contact the police? Ahmed asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Mariam looked down at her hands. I was afraid. I was working without proper documentation then. I couldn't afford to get involved with police investigations. I've regretted it every day since. Fatima processed this information slowly. She went to the Technion? But why? She never mentioned having contacts there. Sarah, who had been listening from nearby, approached the group. Mrs. Khalil, this is very important information. Do you remember anything else? Any other details about that morning? Mariam nodded. There was something else. After she left, I heard one of the security guards talking to his supervisor. He said something about another one of those Arab kids trying to get attention with their science projects. I remember being angry about that comment. The implication hung heavy in the air. Had Lila's attempt to share her research been dismissed because of prejudice? Had she been turned away from an opportunity that might have changed her life, and possibly saved it? Do you know which professor she was trying to see? Sarah asked. I think the name was Goldberg. Professor Goldberg. She kept mentioning that name to the guards. Sarah made a mental note to research Professor Goldberg at the Technion. If Layla had been trying to meet with a specific researcher, there might be records of the appointment or correspondence that could shed light on her final day. As the afternoon science fair presentations continued, the Mansour family struggled to process this new information. For 11 years, they had wondered what had happened to their daughter in her final hours. Now they had at least a partial answer. She had been trying to share her research with the broader scientific community, seeking recognition and possibly mentorship from established researchers. The irony was painful. While Lila's project had been ignored and forgotten by her own school system, she had been actively seeking ways to bring it to the attention of university-level researchers who might have appreciated its significance. She was trying to get help, Fatima said quietly as they watched students present their projects. She knew her work was important, and she was trying to find people who would understand that. Ahmed nodded grimly. And instead, she encountered barriers and prejudice that kept her from being heard. Dr. Rashad, who had overheard Mariam's account, approached the family with a heavy heart. I should have helped her make those connections, he said. I should have reached out to colleagues at universities on her behalf. I failed her. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Dr. Rashad, you supported her as much as you could within the constraints of your position. The failure was systemic, not personal. As the day concluded with the award ceremony, the winning student projects were announced. The first place award went to a 17-year-old girl named Amira from Bethlehem, whose project addressed air quality monitoring in urban environments using low-cost sensors. As she accepted her award, she made a point of mentioning Lila's inspiration. This project exists because Layla Mansour showed us that students can tackle real problems and find real solutions, Amira said, holding her trophy high. She proved that engineering is organized compassion, and that's what I tried to do with my work. The applause that followed seemed to echo through the gymnasium like a promise that Lila's legacy would continue to inspire new generations of innovators who would face fewer barriers and receive more recognition for their efforts to make the world better. But as the families and students dispersed into the Jerusalem evening, the Mansour family was left with new questions about their daughter's final day. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin investigating Professor Goldberg and the circumstances that had led Layla to the Technion on that November morning 11 years ago. Professor David Goldberg still maintained an office at the Technion Innovation Center, though his hair had gone completely white in the years since 2012, and he walked with a slight limp from a hiking accident. When Sarah contacted him through the university directory, his response was immediate and tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Yes, he had written back within hours of her email. "I remember that day very clearly. I've thought about it many times over the years. Can we meet in person?" This conversation deserves more than email or phone calls. They arranged to meet at a cafe in West Jerusalem, neutral ground where they could speak freely. Professor Goldberg arrived early, carrying a worn leather satchel that seemed to contain documents he had brought specifically for this meeting. He was a man in his 70s, with the intense but kind eyes of someone who had spent decades working with brilliant students. When Sarah introduced herself and explained her connection to Layla's story, his response surprised her. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 11 years, he said, settling into his chair with obvious relief, waiting for someone to ask the right questions about what happened that day. Sarah studied his face. "You remember her visit to the Technion?" "I remember that she never made it to my office," Professor Goldberg said, his voice heavy with old regret. "But I should start at the beginning." He opened his satchel and pulled out a folder containing email printouts and handwritten notes. "In October 2012, I received an email from a high school student named Layla Mansour. She had found my contact information through a research paper I had published about sustainable water systems for developing regions." Sarah leaned forward. "She contacted you directly?" "Her email was remarkable," Professor Goldberg continued, pulling out the printed correspondence. "She didn't just ask for a meeting or general advice. She presented a detailed summary of her own research and specifically requested my feedback on several technical aspects of her design." He handed Sarah the printed email, dated October 18, 2012. Reading Layla's words, Sarah could hear the teenager's voice, confident but respectful, passionate but professional. She had clearly researched Professor Goldberg's work thoroughly and identified specific areas where his expertise could help refine her project. "I was impressed," Professor Goldberg admitted. The level of sophistication in her approach was remarkable for a high school student. More than that, she was addressing real-world implementation challenges that many of my graduate students overlooked. "So you agreed to meet with her?" "Absolutely. We scheduled a meeting for November 15th at 10 a.m. I was excited to see her project in person and discuss potential pathways for development." Sarah felt a chill. "But she never made it to your office." Professor Goldberg's expression grew dark. "Security called me around 10:30 that morning. They said a Palestinian teenager had been trying to enter the facility, claiming to have an appointment with me, but they had turned her away." "Why would they do that?" "This is the part that still haunts me," Professor Goldberg said, his voice thick with anger and regret. "When I called security to ask why they hadn't contacted me directly, the head guard said they thought it was suspicious that a Palestinian student would claim to have legitimate business with a research facility. They assumed she was lying about the appointment." The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a stone. They racially profiled her. "Worse than that," Professor Goldberg continued. "When I immediately called them back and told them to find her and bring her to my office, they said she had already left. They suggested I be more careful about who I agreed to meet with in the future." Sarah stared at the email correspondence, trying to imagine Layla's feelings as she was turned away from what should have been a professional meeting that validated her work. "What did you do?" "I tried to contact her immediately. I called the phone number she had provided, sent emails, even reached out to her school, but I never received a response." Professor Goldberg pulled out another document, a missing person poster, that someone had sent him weeks later. "When I learned she had disappeared, I contacted the police to report our scheduled meeting. I thought it might be relevant to their investigation. And they took my statement, but I got the impression they didn't think it was significant. A Palestinian teenager disappearing in 2012. I'm ashamed to say that wasn't treated with the urgency it deserved." Sarah absorbed this information, understanding now the full scope of the barriers Layla had faced. Not only had her work been overlooked by her own educational system, but when she had attempted to seek recognition from the broader scientific community, she had encountered discrimination that prevented her from even presenting her innovations. "Professor Goldberg," Sarah said carefully, "do you think that experience at the Technion might have been connected to her disappearance?" The elderly professor was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. I've wondered about that for 11 years. Was she so discouraged by being turned away that she made a desperate decision? Or did something else happen that day after she left the facility? We may never know for certain, Sarah said, but I want you to know that her work is finally receiving the recognition it deserved. We're implementing her water purification design in refugee camps, and we've established a memorial science fair in her honor. Professor Goldberg's eyes filled with tears. That's wonderful. It's what should have happened 11 years ago. He reached into his satchel one more time and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I've kept copies of all our correspondence, and I've also prepared some technical notes about how her design could be improved and scaled up. I was planning to discuss these with her during our meeting. Sarah accepted the envelope with reverence. Her family will want to see this, and the engineers implementing her design will find your notes invaluable. There's something else, Professor Goldberg said. I've been following developments in sustainable water systems since 2012, partly because of my interest in her work. Several innovations that have been published in recent years are remarkably similar to approaches she outlined in her correspondence with me. You mean other researchers have independently developed similar solutions? Or, Professor Goldberg said carefully, perhaps her ideas influenced the field more than we realize. Academic communities are small, and good ideas have a way of spreading even when their original sources aren't properly credited. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Professor Goldberg made one final observation. You know, I've worked with hundreds of students over my career. What made Lila special wasn't just her technical abilities, though those were exceptional. It was her understanding that engineering serves humanity. That's wisdom that usually takes years to develop. Sarah gathered the documents and prepared to return to East Jerusalem with new pieces of Lila's story. The teenager's final day was now clearer. She had attempted to bridge the divide between her community and the broader scientific establishment, seeking mentorship and recognition for work that could have changed countless lives. Instead, she had encountered barriers that reflected the broader prejudices and suspicions that divided Jerusalem in 2012. Whether those barriers had directly contributed to her disappearance would likely remain unknown, but they had certainly prevented her from receiving the support and recognition that might have changed the trajectory of her life and work. As Sarah drove through the ancient streets of Jerusalem, she reflected on how Layla's story embodied both the tragedy of lost potential and the triumph of ideas that transcend the circumstances of their creation. The teenager who had been turned away from a research facility because of her ethnicity was now inspiring international collaboration on humanitarian engineering projects. That evening, Sarah would visit the Mansour family to share Professor Goldberg's documents and memories. Together, they would continue building the memorial to a brilliant young woman whose vision of engineering as organized compassion was finally receiving the recognition it had always deserved. The jasmine outside Lila's childhood bedroom window would bloom again that spring, its fragrance drifting through a community that had learned to honor the dreams of those who were no longer there to see them fulfilled. And in refugee camps across Jordan and Lebanon, clean water would soon flow through systems inspired by a 16-year-old's determination to solve problems that others had accepted as unsolvable. Layla Mansour had disappeared into silence 11 years earlier, but her voice was finally being heard by the world she had wanted so desperately to help. If stories like Lila's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the innovations of love continue to flow, waiting to guide us toward solutions. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart to see engineering as organized compassion, where every brilliant mind deserves recognition regardless of the barriers they face.